For my independent reading book, I read Stephen Hawking: A Brief History of Time. This book is mainly about, of course, what the title says, a brief history of time and space, as well as the process of how black holes are made and work, as well as the overall process of how light and time travel through space and how it's able to be affected by certain effects of physics, such as wormholes and time travel, and overall workings of how light can bend around black holes as well as planets and stars. Um, One thing I liked about this book is how easy it was to digest. The overall information and the way that he worded it was very easy to understand. I feel like if I took an actual class about the subject, I'd have a lot of a harder time to properly understand the curriculum. But the way he explains it, especially with basic grammar, the most complicated word that I wasn't really familiar with was his use of quarks. But that was overall, he explained that easily as what it's supposed to be. Also, his use of diagrams throughout the book to emphasize how certain things work and how things are affected, and a way of better finding a way that we can visualize what the thing is rather than him just talking about it continuously without giving a proper way to view what he means is also very interesting, and that's why I really liked how he explained stuff in the book. An example of a particularly strong move he made throughout the book as a writer was, like I mentioned before, his use of diagrams and his overall easier way of digesting stuff through easier vocabulary was very useful and helpful. For example, him explaining, let me find it, it's pertaining to black holes. Mark this somewhere. Here. The way that he explained how we originally thought black holes worked and how they actually work through the use of an event horizon, and how that affected our understanding how time and space can bend around a black hole and how they're affected by it. I thought that was very interesting. It was really helpful the way that he used images to make it easier to digest. I feel like that's a very strong move that most writers don't try to make, especially when they're trying to explain certain aspects of physics and more complicated curriculum to audiences who may not be as well versed as many others may be. So it's obvious that while this book still is written and supposedly supposed to be used by people who are already familiar with it, it can still easily be digested by readers who may not be as well versed in the process of wormholes and black holes and how space is affected by a lot of certain things like time. And what does the book teach me? Well, it really just teaches me how stuff works, how stuff really works throughout the universe. One thing that it really did particularly teach me is how time travel is technically possible, but it's to the effect that it won't happen until very far in the future, how wormholes are a major part of this, as well as how black holes really work, how we've thought they've worked, and how a better understanding we have now because of how we figured out things based on his original research, other people's research, among other things. One thing he also did that was really effective and how I really liked about the book is that when talking about original people that he referenced, he adds it in the back of the book. In here, he talks about Albert Einstein, which is somebody he mentioned a lot throughout this book, Galileo, Isaac Newton, and all of these people were like very important people in understanding how this universe worked and how they researched things and how they were able to compile things. It helped me learn more about how these people's minds worked and how truly their research affected how we understand these things as a whole. I feel like one of the also major things I learned is how light and time is truly affected by by just space entirely. I never really understood originally how light can bend around stuff like stars, can bend around stuff like black holes, how mass affects light and time, but through his explanations, that really helped influence and push forward my pure understanding of how the universe worked in its more meticulous factors. Of course, another thing that I also learned that I also talked about already was certain vocabulary words that he used throughout the book. One major thing being quarks. It's a funny word, quarks. You've heard it, obviously you've heard it used before, but most people don't know what it really means. And him explaining what quarks originally meant was incredibly helpful of me understanding how it actually worked. And if you don't know, I wrote it down here. Quarks are just fundamental particles that are used in physics and atoms. It's like people explain it as, how do I write it down here? People explained it as a building block, which is interesting because we've heard the term building block used for other forms of particles before, but seeing a new variation of that and how explained and how it's utilized in something like physics rather than something like how we've seen in biology was really interesting. How different groups of different science interprets it in a different way compared to us and everybody else around them in research and on other things. Overall, it was a very influential piece of literature that I read, and it helped me understand a lot of things that I never really understood originally and that I haven't taken a class on originally. So having this as a more easier to compile and consume piece of media was very interesting in how Stephen Hawking can really bend our understanding in a way that even the most simplest of understandings of somebody can properly digest this kind of information.